There is a kind of prayer that does not begin with the lips, but with the awakening of the heart. Too often we think of prayer as a duty, a formality, a string of words whispered into the silence. But the prayer that awakens the soul is not merely spoken. It is breathed, it is felt, it is lived. It is like a spark striking dry wood until flame rises where there was only coldness. When the soul is truly stirred to pray, it does not bargain with heaven or rehearse memorized phrases as if God were a distant monarch waiting for proper etiquette. Instead, it lays itself bare. It confesses its need without disguise. It trembles with longing for what it cannot supply on its own. It is the cry of a drowning man for air, the thirst of a wanderer in the desert, the reaching of a child for the hand that will not let go. This prayer does not come easily to the proud, for pride prefers to decorate words rather than surrender them. But the broken and the humble find it springing from them almost against their will, because their emptiness can no longer hide itself. This prayer awakens the soul because it shatters illusions. We are skilled at living behind masks, the mask of competence, of control, of sufficiency. But in prayer, when the heart is honest, the mask cannot stay on. The soul stands naked before the one who already sees through it. In that moment, we discover a strange freedom that the self we most fear to expose is the self most tenderly received. Such discovery is not the end of prayer, but its beginning. It is the key that opens the locked door, allowing light to stream into chambers long kept dark. To pray like this is not to escape reality, but to awaken to it. Too often we live half-asleep, going through motions, chasing shadows, numbing ourselves with the ordinary. But when we truly pray, we become aware of the real weight of our lives. We see that our desires are too small, our pursuits too shallow, our fears too misplaced. Prayer does not shrink the world, it enlarges it. It lifts our vision above the trivial and confronts us with eternity pressing upon every moment. The soul that prays in this way cannot return unchanged. What awakens the soul is not eloquence, but honesty. A single sentence, even a single sigh offered in truth, has more power than 1,000 ornate speeches. For the language heaven answers is not the polish of grammar, but the surrender of will. A soul that says, "Here I am, take me, remake me," is a soul that has already begun to wake. And just as dawn comes quietly but irresistibly, so does the light of God seep into the corners of such a life. There is a hidden strength in this kind of prayer. It does not always change circumstances, but it changes the one who prays. It makes the fearful brave, the weary steadfast, the bitter forgiving. It kindles joy where there was only despair. It sharpens the eyes to recognize beauty, even in suffering, and it tunes the heart to trust, even in uncertainty. Such prayer becomes less about asking for things and more about becoming someone, becoming awake, alive, attuned to the pulse of the eternal. So if you would awaken your soul, do not wait for the perfect words. Do not imagine that you must first tidy yourself into worthiness. Begin as you are. Begin with your hunger, your wounds, your longing. Let your prayer rise not from the surface, but from the depths. For when you pray from the depths, you will find that heaven is already nearer than you thought, and your soul, long drowsy, will begin to stir with life. True prayer awakens the soul when it rises from honesty, not eloquence. True prayer awakens the soul when it rises from honesty, not eloquence. It is not the polish of phrases, nor the clever weaving of thoughts, that brings the soul into living contact with the divine. Words can often be a shield behind which the heart hides, a performance meant to impress rather than a cry meant to reveal. But when prayer becomes stripped of pretense, when it becomes nothing more than the heart speaking its raw truth, then something within us stirs that had long been asleep. This kind of prayer does not seek to impress, it seeks to be understood. It does not attempt to bargain, it simply admits need. It is the moment when the soul says, "Here I am as I am," and in saying it discovers that such honesty carries more weight than the most carefully constructed speech. The soul cannot be awakened by repetition alone. Many voices recite, many lips move, yet remain untouched, because the essence of prayer is not in the words themselves, but in the spirit behind them. The most powerful prayer may be but a single sentence spoken in sincerity, or even a sigh that cannot find language, for honesty breaks through barriers where eloquence fails. A soul that speaks plainly to God is a soul that begins to come alive. The veneer of religious performance falls away, and what is left is simple and real, and in that simplicity lies the power to awaken. When prayer is born of honesty, it confronts us with truths we would rather avoid. We admit weakness where we once pretended strength. We confess doubts we had buried. We lay bare fears that gnaw at us in the dark. To pray in honesty is to let light fall on the hidden parts of our being, not because we believe God is unaware of them, but because we can no longer live with the pretense that we are whole without help. This act of exposing our inner life is what rouses the soul from slumber, just as a sleeper startled by light and sound becomes aware of the world again, so too the soul stirred by truthful prayer becomes aware of reality in a way it had long ignored. Such prayer awakens because it requires humility. To speak honestly is to admit that we are not enough, that our attempts at control, our illusions of self-sufficiency have failed us. Eloquence can often conceal pride, but honesty dismantles it. When we strip away the need to sound holy or polished, when we dare to show ourselves as broken, flawed, longing creatures, we step into the posture of truth, and the soul can only be awakened in truth, never in pretense. Pride lulls the spirit into sleep with its soothing lies, but humility jars it awake with reality. That awakening may feel painful at first, like light striking the eyes after long darkness, but it is the beginning of real life. Prayer born of honesty also reorders our desires. We may come to prayer with long lists of what we think we want, but when we speak honestly, we begin to see beneath those surface desires to the deeper ones that drive us. We discover that what we seek is not always comfort or success, but peace, forgiveness, and love. Honesty in prayer peels back the layers of false wants until the truest cries of the heart emerge. It is then that the soul awakens to its own hunger for God Himself, not merely for His gifts. And when that hunger is acknowledged, the soul begins to live in alignment with its deepest purpose. In this way, prayer becomes not an escape from life, but an awakening to it. When honesty guides us, prayer opens our eyes to see where we have deceived ourselves, where we have pursued shadows instead of substance. It makes us aware of our dependence, our fragility, and yet also of our immeasurable worth as ones heard by the Eternal. It draws us into the mystery that though we are small, our honest cry reaches the infinite, and that realization alone is enough to jolt the soul awake. Even silence can be a prayer if it is honest. A silence heavy with longing, a silence carrying sorrow too deep for words, a silence of awe when the weight of truth presses upon us. Such silence awakens more than eloquence ever could. For honesty does not require speech, it only requires reality. And in the reality of silence, the soul often hears more clearly than in the flurry of phrases. Thus, the prayer that awakens the soul is not the one admired by others for its beauty, but the one whispered in secret, perhaps with tears, perhaps with stammering words, perhaps with none at all, but always with the ring of truth. Honesty unlocks the chamber where the soul lies sleeping, and when that door opens, light floods in. The awakening is not always gentle, but it is always real. And once awake, the soul begins to live with a vitality that eloquence alone could never give. Prayer strips away pride and illusion, opening the heart to light and freedom. Prayer strips away pride and illusion, opening the heart to light and freedom. When we approach prayer with honesty, it becomes like a mirror that no longer flatters us, no longer allows us to hide behind masks. Pride has 1,000 disguises, weaving for us stories about our strength, our self-sufficiency, our ability to manage life on our own. Illusion tells us that if we can control circumstances, if we can maintain appearances, then we have no need to bow, no need to ask, no need to surrender. Yet prayer shatters these comfortable lies, not cruelly, but with the piercing clarity of truth. It forces us to stand in the presence of one who sees beyond every disguise, and in that presence, the soul cannot help but feel its frailty. Such exposure might terrify us at first, but in reality it is liberation, because the moment the mask is stripped away, the weight of maintaining it falls off, and the heart can breathe again. When pride dominates, the soul remains asleep, lulled into a shallow existence, convinced it is strong when it is fragile, convinced it is awake when it is dreaming. Pride is a heavy cloak, and we wear it so long that we forget how tired it makes us. In prayer, that cloak is torn away, and the light falls upon us as we are. Illusion withers in that light, because what is false cannot endure the brightness of truth. The soul discovers that its imagined independence was a prison, and though humility feels like loss at first, it is in fact the opening of a door. Through that door streams the light that pride kept out, and with that light comes freedom, the freedom of not having to be more than we are, not having to pretend, not having to hold together a life that secretly trembles at its own fragility. To pray sincerely is to allow that stripping to happen. It is to step forward without defenses, without rehearsed lines, without the need to impress either God or ourselves. In prayer, we are confronted with the reality that we are dependent creatures. We did not give ourselves breath, and we cannot sustain it forever. We did not set the stars in their courses, and we cannot command them to shine or fade. To stand in prayer is to admit that our lives are held by hands greater than our own. This admission bruises pride but heals the heart, for what pride resists as weakness, the soul recognizes as freedom. The illusion of control keeps us anxious, but the surrender of control opens us to peace. The freedom that comes when pride is stripped away is not merely an inward feeling, but a transformation of vision. Prayer removes the fog that illusions spread over our eyes. Where once we were obsessed with appearances, we begin to see substance. Where once we measured ourselves by possessions or status, we begin to see the hollowness of such measures. Where once we feared being exposed, we find relief in being known. This soul that is honest in prayer begins to perceive life differently, no longer bound by the tyranny of what others think, no longer enslaved to false identities, but awake to the truth that we are loved not for what we display, but for who we are beneath the display. That realization carries light into every hidden chamber, and that light brings with it the freedom to live without fear. Pride resists prayer because it dreads exposure, yet what it resists most fiercely is the very thing that sets the soul free. Illusion comforts us for a while with its softness, but it cannot bear the weight of reality. The moment we are honest in prayer, the illusion collapses, and though the collapse feels like breaking, it is really awakening. The heart that was clenched in self-protection loosens. The burden of falsehood drops away. The soul, long confined in its own defenses, stretches again, as though remembering what it means to breathe. Freedom in prayer is not found in eloquence, not in perfectly crafted petitions, but in the surrender of our pretense. This stripping away is often uncomfortable. No one enjoys being reminded of weakness. No one delights in seeing illusions crumble. Yet, just as a surgeon's cut is painful but necessary, the work of prayer cuts away what stifles life. Pride would rather keep the wound hidden, but prayer lays it bare so that healing can come. Illusion insists that we are whole, but prayer reveals the fracture, not to condemn but to restore. And when the healing light enters those places we have kept hidden, the soul experiences a freedom it never thought possible. It is no longer bound by fear of failure, no longer exhausted by endless pretending, no longer enslaved by the need to appear strong. In that moment, the soul discovers that freedom was not found in clinging to pride, but in letting it go. What remains after pride and illusion are stripped away is not emptiness but clarity. We begin to see ourselves truly and God truly. The lies that once bound us lose their grip, and in their place comes a sense of peace, a quiet strength that is not our own but which sustains us. The soul that has been awakened by such prayer finds itself walking lighter, no longer chained to appearances, no longer shadowed by fear. It finds joy in truth, even when truth reveals weakness, because weakness covered by light becomes a place of grace, and it is grace, not illusion, that carries the soul into freedom. The soul is transformed not by perfect words, but by surrender and trust. The soul is transformed not by perfect words, but by surrender and trust. We often imagine that the value of prayer lies in its eloquence, as though heaven were swayed by polished sentences and finely arranged expressions. Yet the reality is that the deepest movements of the soul are often beyond language, beyond the reach of carefully chosen words. What matters is not the skill of speaking, but the willingness to yield, not the beauty of the phrases, but the openness of the heart. The soul begins to awaken when it releases the need to control the conversation and instead allows itself to be carried by the current of trust. In that yielding, the soul discovers that it is not the architect of its own transformation, but the clay in the hands of a greater potter. Surrender in prayer is not weakness but recognition. It is the recognition that we are finite and frail, that we cannot command the tides of life or bend eternity to our will. It is the recognition that we are held by a strength greater than ours, and that our part is not to dictate but to entrust. Trust grows when we stop clinging to outcomes, when we no longer pray as though we could manipulate heaven into serving our designs, but instead offer ourselves to be reshaped, redirected, and renewed. This posture of trust lifts the soul out of its narrow anxieties and places it into a wider horizon where peace can take root. The words of such a prayer may be few, but the power of it lies in the heart's posture, a posture of surrender. The transformation that comes from surrender is profound. When the soul releases its grip on control, fear begins to lose its dominion. Fear thrives in the illusion that everything depends on us, that every thread must be held tightly in our hands. But trust unravels that illusion, teaching the soul to rest in the knowledge that it is not abandoned, that it is not adrift in chaos, but guided, watched, and loved. This trust is not naive, for it does not deny suffering or trial, but it sees them through a different lens. It believes that even in darkness there is meaning, even in loss there is presence, even in silence there is a listening ear. And when the soul embraces this, its transformation begins. Perfect words cannot accomplish what surrender does, because eloquence may still serve pride, while surrender silences pride altogether. A prayer that dazzles with language but hides the heart achieves nothing, while a simple whisper of trust can shake the very foundations of the soul. Trust is not a performance, it is a release. It is the moment when we stop demanding answers and begin resting in presence, when we stop dictating paths and begin following with humility. The soul that has learned to trust is no longer enslaved to its own designs, but is set free to discover a deeper life, one not built on control but on communion. In trust, the soul learns patience. It stops measuring every moment by immediate satisfaction and begins to see life in longer arcs. The restless striving for instant solutions gives way to a quieter confidence that what is needed will be given in time. This patience is not passive resignation, but active endurance, a steady courage that flows from the conviction that we are held securely. Transformation takes place in this patience, as the hurried heart slows and learns to rest. In surrender, the soul begins to hear whispers it once drowned out with its frantic demands. It learns to notice small graces, to savor what is given, to be present without fear of what tomorrow might bring. The soul that surrenders in prayer also finds a new freedom. Instead of being crushed under the burden of self-reliance, it discovers the lightness of dependence. To trust is to admit that we are not the center of the universe, not the makers of our own destiny in the absolute sense. And though pride may resist this, the soul finds relief in it. There is freedom in knowing that we do not have to control everything, freedom in yielding to the one who already knows the path, freedom in trusting that we are cared for even when the road is steep. This freedom reshapes how we live, how we see others, and how we carry our burdens. Through surrender, love deepens. Trust opens the heart to intimacy, for where there is no trust, there can be no closeness. The soul that yields in prayer finds itself drawn nearer, learning to rest in the assurance of being known fully and loved completely. This is a love that does not require perfection of words or deeds, but embraces us as we are, and that embrace changes us more than any striving could. The transformation of the soul is not the result of eloquence or mastery, but of yielding to love. To surrender is to be willing to be held, and to trust is to allow that holding to redefine who we are. In the end, the soul discovers that surrender is not the loss it once feared, but the very ground of its awakening. Words may fail, eloquence may falter, but trust remains. The one who bows in prayer not with grand speeches, but with a yielded heart, finds that light enters, peace settles, and life takes on a new depth. It is in trust that the soul is remade, and in surrender that it truly begins to live.